point I want to make is that the structural factors that drive economic performance, not just economic growth, which is just a number, but the transformation of these economies into something of higher quality, greater living standards and so on, I think we are going to see a confluence of positives that will elevate ASEAN to a higher level of performance. Secondly, of course, I do want to look at the risks, because there are risks around this scenario. The main risk is actually political. So I'll spend a bit of time looking at the politics about it, but also to introduce the notion of economic resilience and how economies can manage risks, bounce back from the risks that do materialize. So that's the agenda for the next 25 odd minutes. And I want to try and put things succinctly so that we have time for Q&A. So let me start by looking at this confluence of positives. And essentially, they come from several sources. One is that you have improving what I call supply side fundamentals, much more supportive business ecosystem, improving infrastructure. In other words, things that make it easy for investors to earn a decent return on their capital. If their perception of the return on capital adjusted for risks improves, there is more investment. More investment means more growth, right? So that's one. Second thing is we are seeing signs of improving competitiveness of this region relative to other regions. If you're much more competitive, you will attract more capital, your export market share will increase, and your growth will improve. Thirdly, we see some signs of improving synergies, positive spillovers from improving integration. So we have had a series of new trade agreements, the CPTPP, which is called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the RCEP, and so on. And these are going to provide us with further opportunities for growth as well. So all these things combined to produce a higher rate of investment, which is the investment share of GDP. And basically, it's arithmetic. If your investment share of GDP goes up and there is no change in the productivity of investment, then arithmetically it is immediate that your growth rate improves. Now, of course, a lot of these positives that I will outline to you are going to be gradual and accumulating over time. So it's not something that's happening dramatically, right? But that is the story of a lot of countries' economic development, where you have lots of slow moving, gradual, incremental changes, but which accumulate under the surface until they hit some kind of critical point, and then suddenly you get massive economic liftoff. And I think we're going to see that in ASEAN. So what are the supply side fundamentals that are improving? Well, in many countries, investors had been deterred in the past because of labor market regulations that made it actually quite risky to set up a big business in a country and hire workers and so on. In Indonesia, for instance, the labor market reform of 2002, 2003 introduced so many onerous requirements on employers that big businesses began to be really scared of investing in the country. For instance, it was very difficult to retrench workers. If your business went down, you were stuck with a huge payroll which you could not adjust down. It was even more ridiculous. There were cases where if you found that one of your employees had stolen from you, you had the evidence, the guy's a crook, and you fire him, you still have to pay him 2 years of wages. Now, of course, these kinds of things just don't help with encouraging investment, whether foreign or domestic. So now President Joko Widodo has had the courage, the political courage, to reform all this. And as a result, I expect as these new regulations are enforced, Indonesia becomes much more attractive and investment starts to flow in, particularly foreign investment. Secondly, across the region, you're seeing more and more deregulation, the removal of obstacles created by government policies towards the free and flexible practice of business. So whether it is issuance of permits, securing licenses, whether it is regulations that, at the provincial level contradicted what the local government regulations said, making it really impossible for businesses to stay on the right side of the law, whether it was obstacles to cross-border trading. A lot of these things in Indonesia, even in the Philippines, are being improved. And that really makes life so much easier for businesses to operate. Just recently, we've had a significant liberalization on the foreign investment in Indonesia. So previously there were a lot of caps on which sectors particular companies could invest in if they were foreign. These things have been reduced significantly. And in Indonesia, again, you've got a lot of bureaucratic reforms that have been introduced since President Joko Widodo became president in 2014. Another area of improvement, for instance, in the Philippines, where you've had a long, long history where large and powerful families controlled large parts of the economy, distorted them, raised prices, raised costs to other parts of the business, made the Philippines very uncompetitive. Now, this administration of Mr. Duterte is beginning to reduce some of these and has also introduced very important tax reforms. And that makes the Philippines more attractive as a business proposition. So there is still a long way to go. I can tell you quite honestly that operating a business in some of these countries remains quite difficult, but it is much easier than before. So if you look at this measure of the ease of doing business, which the World Bank has been doing for quite some time now, the World Bank does a survey of thousands of companies all over the world and asks them, how easy is it now in this country to hire a worker, to fire a worker, to secure registration for a business, to secure an import license, whatever. And they put it together in the form of a measure of an index, and then they rank countries. And you can see how the Southeast Asian economies in the last 10 years have really begun to improve significantly, right? So India, Philippines, Malaysia, and so on. But of course, if you look at the same table, you find that in India, a competitor to ASEAN, we are also seeing significant improvement. So it's a very competitive area. We can be improving ourselves, but if others improve faster than us, we still have a long way to go. So it is still not work fully done, but we are moving in the right direction and it helps a lot. Another area of supply side improvement is infrastructure. For a long time, the lack of roads from industrial estates to ports, power supply, all these little things, port capacity, airport capacity, road congestion, all these things raise the cost of doing business because logistics costs became very, very high in these countries. So after 20 years of underinvestment in all these elements of physical infrastructure, what we're seeing in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines is a significant change. And there's a huge commitment of funds to improve roads, mass transit for the large urban centers, and lots of ports, airports being addressed. More than the commitment of physical funds, there's also a commitment to improve management. So for instance, in some ports in Indonesia, simply by introducing new management techniques and processes, they found that without having to build any new infrastructure, they were able to improve the speed with which they turn around container ships. Right? So there's a lot of improvement in infrastructure, and this means a very positive business environment. The second element of my argument is improving competitiveness, right? ASEAN competes with the rest of the world, with China, with India and other South Asian economies like Bangladesh, with Latin America, with Eastern Europe, with Northern Africa, like Morocco, for investment and for gaining market share in the large markets like Europe and the US and Japan, right? So competitiveness is very important, right? And what we are seeing is, again, relatively speaking, ASEAN is beginning to improve its competitiveness, right? In China, for instance, costs are rising and the currency has also strengthened. And that changes ASEAN's business proposition relative to China. And as a result, even Chinese companies themselves are moving production out of China to countries like Vietnam and so on. Now, of course, for the Chinese, this is very low value stuff, garments, toys, footwear, Christmas decorations, things like that. But they still create a lot of employment in countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. Now what's happening is that you, of course, in the last few years, you must have heard that there's been a trade war between the United States and China. And this is a part of a bigger geopolitical struggle. And as a result, many companies are beginning to feel that maybe it's too risky to put so much of their production in China, even if the costs and the returns are compelling. Maybe it makes sense to have China plus one, China plus two strategy. And in that context, Southeast Asia looks very appealing, right? So another reason for production to move out of China into our region, right? Now, of course, not everything is positive. Now, the one problem is that China has become so competitive domestically. They've got economies of scale, improving technology, and so on. So they're building their own supply chain, and they're now manufacturing a lot of the components that ASEAN used to export to China. So we're losing some degree of market share within China, but overall, we're gaining outside. What is also interesting is that because of the improvement in per capita incomes in ASEAN, ASEAN too is becoming more and more popular as a market. 660 million people, average rate of growth across the region 5 to 6%. It's a very compelling story. So people are coming to ASEAN not just to produce for exports, but also to produce to serve the domestic market, which is growing and becoming more appealing. This is just a slide you can look at your own leisure, but it gives you all the examples of the companies that are actually moving production out of China to our part of the world. Right? I mentioned competitiveness. And one way of looking at competitiveness is to look at your share of world exports. And this chart is quite interesting. You can see how China's share of world exports has grown incredibly since it started to liberalize its economy, right? And you can see how India is also becoming more competitive, but at a slower pace. Now, interestingly, as China improved its share, ASEAN remarkably was able to hold on to its market share and in fact actually grow it by a small amount. So it is other regions of the world like Hong Kong and Korea, Germany, the US that lost market share as China rose. Super competitive China gained market share, but ASEAN remained competitive enough to hold on to its market share. And I think that was very good reflection of ASEAN's underlying positives. What about the share of foreign investment? This is also an important metric of competitiveness. And this chart shows how for many years, China's share was well above the share of the core ASEAN economies. But in recent years, ASEAN has caught up with and overtaken China. ASEAN is now becoming yet again, as it was in the 1990s, a very, very appealing destination for foreign investment. Ultimately, when you talk about competitiveness, it is not so much about costs. If your costs are high, like they are, say, in a country like Singapore, or in the city of London, or in the city of New York, they can still be super competitive as, say, a financial center if the returns that they promise to investors are extremely attractive. And so we look at return on capital for the businesses that invest in different countries as another measure of competitiveness. And this shows that Many ASEAN countries, like Vietnam in particular, Malaysia as well, are actually very, very competitive. So this is yet another reason to be positive about ASEAN. Now, let me talk a bit about resilience and moving away from the positives to look at some of the potential downside risks and our capacity to manage these risks. The fact is, and I think Prakash will talk about this in more detail, the world environment is becoming more volatile. There will be, I think, an increased frequency, increased unpredictability of potential shocks. So there is no escape from this. You cannot cut yourself off from the world and escape all this volatility. All you can do is to build your resilience to potential shocks, whether it's a financial shock, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's some kind of geopolitical shock. And what does resilience mean? Resilience means the ability to bounce back from a shock. It doesn't mean that you're totally invulnerable to a shock. You will, if you're part of the world economy, every now and then you will be hit by some kind of problem, right? The question is, can you recover quickly? And we think that ASEAN has that capacity to rebound from a bad experience. And this is because of improving diversification of economic activity, of exports. It's coming out of improved management of the financial sector, so your balance sheets of companies, of the government, of banks, no longer drags your economy down the minute you have some kind of problem. Right? And it also means, very important part of resilience, is the capacity for swift, effective, credible policy response. If the government can respond to a bad event by immediately boosting demand through, say, fiscal spending or by cutting interest rates, then the economy can handle a crisis better. And we saw this in Singapore, how the Singapore government's capacity for massive intervention to support the economy during last year's pandemic really helped to keep our economy afloat despite the very severe circuit breaker lockdown that we encountered. So we can bring all these various components of resilience into an index to see how countries are doing in terms of resilience. And what this chart shows of our resilience index is that across the board, countries, including Vietnam, which was very, very poor on economic resilience in the past, have improved significantly. Their financial sectors are better supervised and better managed. The policy effectiveness is so much better. Central banks, for instance, are much more credible. When they say something, financial markets believe them, right? And economies have become more diversified. We are probably going to see a whole slew of structural changes in the world economy that we will also have to learn to adjust to. There will be more protectionism, for instance. Even with the new administration in the United States, which is pursuing a more rational policies, we are seeing elements of protectionism even in the Biden administration. And that is going to be a challenge for Asia. For instance, the US administration, I think, is going to criticize ASEAN countries over this issue of alleged currency manipulation, because the US for a long time has felt that ASEAN countries tend to undervalue their currencies. But beyond that, we're also going to see a lot of dislocation. There are going to be big technological changes that will upend the sector dynamics. Big companies that are currently competitive and profitable will fail. And new industries will emerge. It will be a period of tumult and not easy to adjust to. And the key thing, besides resilience to shocks, will be economic flexibility. How effectively, quickly, and seamlessly can countries adjust to these long-term structural changes? That is a key question, right? And what drives that is, one, top-down policy responses, because it's very important that the government organizes that response. And secondly, from the bottom up, how companies and individuals themselves respond to these big opportunities from technology, but also the risk of dislocation. Right? So finally, we have political risk, right? And the fact of the matter is that geopolitics is going to be a big challenge. Why? Because the big fight between the US and China, a lot of that is going to be conducted within our region. Southeast Asia and East Asia will be the main arena of contention between these two big powers. And that makes our environment a riskier one. It also probably means that our countries have no choice but to divert precious resources that should be devoted to economic development to defense. So that's not good, right? And unfortunately, the ASEAN organization is still not cohesive and united enough to really stand up to this kind of big power related problems. So this is just something that will be there, and every now and then there will be some problem that arises because of this big fight. And then, of course, you've got country risks. In Myanmar, I think many of you must have read that we have a very, very sad development of the people protesting against military domination. At least 500 to 600 people have been killed, including little babies. Very sad. But this hurts ASEAN as a whole. In Thailand, which is a very important part of the region, we have protests, unresolved tensions, deep social divisions, and the possibility of a big political dislocation. In Malaysia, with which Singapore is very integrated, there are also growing political risks, a possible early election, and great fragmentation in politics. So these are the risks that we will have to learn to manage. But overall, I think this is potentially the great moment for ASEAN. If we can manage these risks, and I think we can learn to eventually, the economic fundamentals are improving, and we should see a significant acceleration in economic growth in the region. That's positive for all the countries. It's, of course, potentially very, very positive for Singapore. So let me stop here and pass on to my fellow panelists, and I hope you'll have lots of questions to ask when we come to the Q&A later. Thank you very much.
Inviting me back here. It's always one of the events of the year that I look forward to. It's always nice to engage with students and educators. Unfortunately, this will have to be a virtual event this year, but we'll try and make the best of it as much as we can. I hope everyone can see my screen. So what I'm going to do in the time that I have is I'm going to kind of step back a little bit from what Manu presented really well about the region and talk a bit more about global developments, because I think we are at a very interesting time, and there are a lot of shifting trends in the world that I think it's useful for us to think about and also to discuss. So before the pandemic started, ourselves over at GIC, we kind of sat back and we thought about, what were the key economic trends, both affecting the real economy as well as financial markets over the 2010s. And when we think back over the past decade, we came up with this list of things that you see on the left-hand side. So let me go through them one by one. So the first one is this concept of the 1%. I'm sure most of you who have been watching the news or reading papers have heard about this idea of the 1%. And this, in a way, reflects the extent of wealth concentration as well as income inequality that has accelerated over the past decade. So a lot of focus was placed on this kind of 1% of the overall distribution and how that 1% was kind of shifting away from the rest. The second trend was what we called here as Wall Street. Wall Street, as most of you know, is kind of the main street that runs in the financial district of New York. And it was seen that the past decade was very favorable to Wall Street. And so, stock markets did really well, and as well as government policy seemed to want to favor more rapid growth in financial markets. Related to that is this third point of deregulation. You saw a lot of cutbacks of red tape globally, and once again, to kind of help boost business, as well as kind of creating these quasi-monopolies, which I'll talk about a bit later. The next one is globalization. Globalization was not new to the past decade. It actually kind of reinvigorated itself in the 1990s, but it was a feature of the past decade where you did have a lot more intermingling of global supply chains in most parts of the world. The other feature, when we look back over the past decade, was kind of lower taxes. So tax rates were cut in most jurisdictions in the world, especially with regards to corporate taxes. And then the other phenomenon that we saw over the past decade was pretty deflation, but actually it was really low inflation. So even here in Singapore, inflation rates were relatively modest, but you had other parts of the world. In Europe, inflation was only around 1%. Places like Japan, off and on, they actually flipped back into deflation. So it was a period of very mild inflationary pressures. And then finally, cash. We still kind of used a lot of cash. Going to anywhere from the hawker center here or most of the places, the exchange of physical cash was still pretty dominant. If you take all these things together, the past decade was one which was very favorable for business. It was very favorable for the kind of owners of capital in the economy. If we shift over to what we think this next decade is going to be, you can see that for almost all of those themes that we thought were relevant for the past decade, things are going to change. This issue of inequality has become much more prominent and is featuring in almost every policy discussion globally. Instead of Wall Street, the discussion is going to shift to Main Street. It's a very US-centric way of thinking things. So, Main Street is kind of the key shopping, rather the key area where people buy things. So the idea here would be, if you map this to Singapore, it's kind of a shift from the CBD to the heartlands, if you will. There's also going to be much more re-regulation. People are thinking about how to deal with these monopolies that have emerged, how to deal about data privacy, how to deal about environmental issues. So instead of deregulation, we think we're going to shift much more to re-regulation. And then, as Manu mentioned earlier, there's a lot more protectionism. There's a lot more countries thinking about having security of supply chains. So this notion of self-sufficiency is also gaining traction. And then the view on taxation also has fundamentally shifted. Instead of lower taxes globally, actually we're going to see probably an environment where taxes start going up. And then, as I mentioned in this presentation, instead of a period of very muted inflation pressures, we could actually be seeing a world where inflation picks up. And then, as most of you have already experienced, instead of using physical cash, there's a big global push now to start using digital cash. So when we look at across all these dimensions, it really is a bit of a sea change with regards to the kind of key macro and market trends that we think is going to play out over the next decade. And when I end this presentation, I want to make a pitch to everyone here that actually it's a really exciting time to be an economist, because a lot of these issues, really the work is still very much in its infancy, and there's a lot of scope for you to add value and also to learn about what's going on in the world. Before I continue, though, I do want to say that we talk a lot about post-pandemic and post-COVID, But the fact of the matter is, actually, we are not done with COVID just yet. This chart on the bottom left here tries to give an indication of these various lockdown measures that have been in place globally. So it does it two ways. One is by looking at the rules in the countries. So, in Singapore, like, you can only have 8 people sitting in a table or in different groups, restriction on the number of people that can visit you. And then there's also behavioral restrictions, right? These are restrictions where even if there's no rules, people just voluntarily don't want to go to crowded places. And the way that we track that actually is by using data from Apple or from iPhones, as well as Google. And these are able to track how much people are moving around, either between home and work, between home and the office place. And what we can see from this chart here is that everything is calibrated to 0 at the pre-pandemic date, which is the beginning of 2020. So the higher this index goes, it means that the more restrictions and the less mobility that people are facing. So a few things stand out here. The first one is that China is really way ahead of the pack. It has managed the COVID situation really well, such that within the borders of China, mobility is almost back to pre-pandemic levels. So you can see from this index here, the line for China is basically back at 0. But it's a very different story for the rest of the world. For the rest of the world, the mobility of people within the economies is still somewhere between 20 to 50% less than it was pre-pandemic. And then there's also regional variations. Western Europe is still dealing with lockdowns, even in places like Germany, because they are experiencing another wave of COVID. Latin America, Brazil, hospitals are also currently under strain. So the COVID situation is something which is still very much present with us. And the hope is that the vaccination pace picks up sufficiently that we can manage to contain the virus before new variants come up. For those of you who are interested where Singapore lies on this scale, we're at about 17 on this index, which means that relative to a pre-COVID world, we're about 17% less mobility within Singapore. So let me turn now to how we see the global economies developing from here. And the theme that I want to leave with you is that it's going to be a very divergent recovery. So what do I mean by divergence? So I talked a little bit earlier about how COVID is still very much with us at the moment. And we think that even in the near term, it is still going to impact activity because of these lockdowns and social distancing restrictions. But the pace of vaccination has improved and it is going to pick up. And we think from the second quarter and third quarter of this year, you will actually get a very strong recovery in global growth. And you can see that from the chart on the right-hand side, which plots real GDP, once again indexed to the pre-COVID levels. And you can see that actually the global economy is expected to rebound quite strongly and actually get back to where it was pre-COVID, somewhere around the middle of this year. This is actually a significant development. I still remember in March of last year, which was probably one of the worst periods of the COVID crisis, we thought that we were going to be in this COVID situation for a very long time. And it was truly the innovation of scientists, I think, to bring to market vaccines at a much faster pace than we have ever seen. Just for record, I believe the fastest vaccine that was developed prior to COVID was for measles, and that took 4 years. But this time around, we were able to get trials run sufficiently fast, able to get technology to pick up. And so because of that, along with the considerable amount of policy stimulus that has been put in place, we think the economies will be bouncing back relatively strongly. But once again, it will be differentiated, right? As you can tell from the chart on the right-hand side, you can see that the lines are all kind of spread out, right? So some countries are going to be growing fast. Some countries are going to be growing a bit slower. And what's going to govern this? I would say probably three main things. So the first one is how well economies handle COVID. And as you can see, places like China, for example, have handled COVID relatively well. Second is the degree of policy stimulus. And I'll talk a little bit about how countries are differing according to that. And the third is the nature of economies. And so the economies that were able to latch on to the export sector, which actually did relatively well through COVID, those economies have managed to bounce back faster. Economies that rely a lot more on tourism, so in our region, Thailand being one of them, unfortunately, they're going to be recovering at a much slower pace. We can see these effects in another way of thinking about recovery, which is that prior to 2019, we could have drawn a trend line, right? Like what were we thinking about the forecasts of GDP pre-COVID? And that is the dashed line that you can see in the bottom few charts. And then the solid line just shows actually how economies have turned out after that and where the path is going to go. And you can see three different stories here. On the extreme right-hand side, you can see China. So China is one, as I mentioned earlier, which has handled COVID relatively well. And so you saw a very sharp rebound. But when you think about the extent of stimulus, there actually have been, at the margin, tightening policy a little bit and withdrawing stimulus. So they're an economy which kind of gets back to the trend, but stays on the trend. US, which is the economy in the middle, has a different story. Right? They did not manage COVID that well. About 500,000 people have died because of COVID. But they have deployed massive amounts of stimulus, one of the most in across developed markets. And as you can see, the pattern there is that not only are they expected to get back to the pre-COVID trend, but they actually also expected to go past it. Right? So that's the power of deploying stimulus even after the worst of the GDP crisis is behind them. And then you have Europe. And Europe here is a mixture of both. Initially, they handled COVID really well, but then later they in a way bungled up the deployment of the vaccines. And so the GDP growth has not really been able to recover because they've been going in and out as much as in and out of lockdowns over time. And you can see the GDP path there. It went down, it went up, and it went back down again. And then on the stimulus side, yes, they've been providing stimulus and they have been able to get together in the worst of the crisis, but it's not as strong as the decline in activity. So there you see actually GDP remaining below trend for many years. And when we map this kind of framework to thinking even about the ASEAN countries, you can kind of get a similar picture. So countries that have handled COVID very well are the ones that are likely to do better. And then those that have also resulted to a lot of stimulus. Where it becomes very challenging for ASEAN, I think, is the cross-border mobility of people. And as I mentioned, Thailand is one case, but you also have some of the tourist destinations in Indonesia, Malaysia, where it will take a long time for borders to be fully open. So thinking about the post-COVID economy and the recovery is you have to think about a very divergent picture. Some economies that are really going to be taking off, and then there are going to be some economies which are lagging behind. And this will create its own challenges when either interest rates start to go up or inflation starts to pick up. But let me turn now to I think, a second very important change that's happening in the post-COVID environment, and that is a change in the way of thinking of the conduct of macro policy. So I'm calling it here a paradigm shift, which just means that across some of the major central banks and major governments, people are rethinking about the way the frameworks and the conduct of both monetary as well as fiscal policy. Let me start with monetary policy. As most of you are fully aware, especially when you look at interest rates that are being given to you on your bank accounts, that interest rates in Singapore as well as globally are the lowest they've been in a very long time. In fact, in some places in Europe, as well as in Japan, interest rates are even negative. I'm sure for the educators here, if you were looking at textbooks 10 years ago, people didn't even think that interest rates could go negative, but yet that's where we are at this moment. And the reason for that is that central banks are trying their best to stimulate the economy, and even when they cut interest rates to zero, they're not getting that much traction in activity. So you look at the chart on the right-hand side. This goes across a range of developed markets. You can see in the prior to the global financial crisis in the mid-2000s, there's a wide range of interest rates. Only one country, Japan, was at the zero interest rate level. If you fast forward to where we are today, everyone has converged to where Japan is. The euro area, the policy interest rate is now at minus 50 basis points. Japan, it's minus 10. In the US, it's effectively close to zero. So everyone is at very, very low interest rates. But I think the important change, and this is why I think the paradigm changes, is that central banks are also changing the way and how they plan to react to future developments. So if you look at most of your econ textbooks, usually there is some concept of how central banks respond to inflation. And usually the way that they do is to think about how inflation is likely to evolve going forward, right? So you have a lot of trained economists sitting in central banks, building inflation models and looking at projections a few years out. And the reason central banks have always wanted to be preemptive is because they know that monetary policy affects the real economy with lags, right? And so the previous paradigm was always one which, if central banks saw that unemployment rates were falling, the economy was starting to heat up, that they would start raising interest rates. But now they're likely to change. In fact, the US Federal Reserve has already said that, actually, no, we're going to wait until we see inflation happening before we react, right? So in other words, rather than being ahead of inflation, they're actually almost committing to be behind inflation. And part of the reason why they want to do that is because inflation helps them bring the real interest rate, which is the nominal interest rate minus inflation, even lower, right? So as you can see, even though the nominal interest rates are down to zero, what really matters for the economies are real interest rates. And one way to get real interest rates down, if you cannot cut nominal rates more, is to have inflation going up. And so that's what they're trying to promote at the moment. But the second reason is that there's also almost an explicit consideration by the central banks that they want to provide easy financing conditions for the government, right? So, in the COVID crisis, a lot of economies have spent money. Even Singapore, our total size of fiscal packages is about 20% of GDP. And in some of the major markets, central banks are saying we actually need higher fiscal spending to help boost the economy. And what we're going to do is play our part by keeping interest rates low. And once again, this is a very different change from how policy was made in the past. And then finally, the third mention, and coming back to this 1% and the 99% that I mentioned earlier, is that considerations of inequality are also coming into discussions at the central bank, along with climate change. And when it comes to inequality, there is this concept that a rising boat, kind of a rising sea levels rather, lifts all boats, right? And so a belief of we want to let the economy run hot. It's okay if inflation goes up a little bit, but it will bring more people into the labor market and it will help reduce inequality. This was never part of the discussion pre-COVID, but it's now very much front and center. So when we put all of these things together, there is a significant likelihood that the risk of higher inflation moving forward is very tangible. And as Manu said, this will create challenges for the rest of the world because of this divergent recovery, that they may be at different stages of the cycle and different capacity to respond to this environment of higher inflation. But I also say that this attitude towards debts and deficits across the world are changing. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, this tracks the above the line fiscal measures. So these are the measures that were deliberately done by governments to help stem the COVID crisis. And you can tell that the advanced economies, so the developed markets, have just spent almost twice as much as the emerging markets to help boost the economies. And this is partly one of the reasons why we think there will be a divergent recovery. But at the same time, the attitudes towards government debt has also changed dramatically. And part of this reason goes back to the behavior of monetary policy and the ability to keep interest rates low. For those of you who follow the debate, you will notice that there's this big discussion about R and G. And what that means is that if interest rates can remain low, and importantly, below the level of the growth rate, actually levels of debts can be self-financing. Why? Because you borrow $1 and you invest it in the economy, and that grows at the rate of GDP. And so therefore your return in the next period is actually higher than what you need to pay in terms of your interest rate. And so there's this concept that actually debts can be okay because you are able to finance at a rate that's lower than your economy is growing. But this is a very tricky concept, and it does involve a lot of risks. I've highlighted 3 types of countries where you can get into problems. Those that rely on external financing, where you rely a lot on foreigners to finance your deficits. It also relies on the ability to borrow in your own currency, as well as the credibility of institutions. So public debt is going to be here to stay. A lot of countries have a much more relaxed attitude towards it. But I think that it will become challenging for a certain set of countries. And these 2 things, the rate of interest you borrow, as well as the level of growth, can change very rapidly. And so as much as the current environment is one where interest rates are low and growth is high, you could very easily be in a different equilibrium. And I think that will be a lot more difficult for countries to continue financing the elevated rates of borrowing. So once again, this is going to lead to the divergence in the recovery, and it will actually also, at the margin, increase the odds of higher inflation. Finally, the third trend I want to talk about, and which I think all the students here are very much well aware of, is digitization. The reason I say everyone is really well aware of is that we are really fortunate to be in a region where we are almost digital natives, right? So kids here grow up with actually their first interaction with a bank could even be opening a bank account online, which is very different from the environment which Manu and I grew up in, where you actually had to go to a physical branch, you had to meet someone, you had to fill out a lot of forms. So we are a lot of digital natives here. And this is a trend that has been accelerated by the COVID crisis. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, this looks at the behavior of different stock market sectors relative to the overall index. And if you look at the sectors at the top, those were the winners from COVID, and the ones at the bottom were the relative losers. So if you look at the ones on the top, see the sector that did the best just before the announcement of the vaccine, which was by Pfizer, which was in November last year, it was retail. And as I'm sure all of you know, the biggest company within that retail sector globally was Amazon. Right? So Amazon did phenomenally well during this crisis. And then the software sector also did really well. Everybody was staying at home. You're rolling out your Microsoft products. Cloud computing started taking off in a big way. So software also did really well. Some of you may be surprised that autos is the third sector. Well, the largest company in the auto sector at the moment is Tesla, which, as you know, is also it can be seen in many ways as a technology company. So really, it was kind of technology that really took off. And then if you look at the bottom side, you see some of the what they call the old economy stuff. So energy suffered the worst, airlines because of global travel, and as well as banks because of the low interest rates and likely growing credit problems. So technology really was a winner through the whole pandemic. And we continue to see this to be a winner. This is a chart that we look at internally, even pre-COVID. We have two kind of dimensions here. So the y-axis talks about the frequency of purchase, so things you purchase a lot versus things that you purchase very little. And then the x-axis talks about the kind of very high value per unit and things that need to be very bespoke. Pre-COVID, we didn't think that we could buy vegetables online. Even if we did, it was a very small share. But that has taken off tremendously. People are buying groceries, even hawker meals online. And then even if we go to more bespoke things like healthcare, there's been a real a range of increase in telemedicine. People prefer to talk to a doctor over WhatsApp or over some online facility rather than going to a clinic where things could be more restrictive. So the scope of what can be actually digitized has increased tremendously. And I think this has a lot of potential, even for our region, because as I said, we really are digital natives, and there are a lot of different elements where we can exploit, both in terms of the ability for companies being based anywhere in the region to scale to the entire region, but also to help providing with logistics, because that last mile delivery is still something that's very important. And Singapore is one of the economies which has very strong logistic skills. So this idea of digitization, I think, is one that's really here to stay. I'm going to wrap up now, just in the interest of time, and just to talk about where to from here. And I just want to reiterate my point here, where I think that this post-COVID environment is really a great time to be an economist, and I think all of you here, both educators as well as students, should really be on top of what's happening in the world, as well as being able to contribute to the discussions. Like I said, new paradigms in macro policy are opening up. We talk about the digital economy, but the economics around it are still being explored. No one really understands how do you think about a company like Google, which is a monopoly in many ways, but offers things for free. How do you think about regulation of those kind of economies? We are faced with digital currencies. Most of you here must have known Bitcoin, which is one of the best performing assets of last year. How do we think about those currencies? Are they going to be in competition with some of the more traditional currencies? And then the inflation process as well. As much as we talk about it, it's still not well understood. So all of these things, I think, is just a fantastic time to be an economist, and it's a fantastic things to appreciate. So let me stop there, and looking forward to the Q&A later. Basil, back to you.
Thank the organizer for the MOE and the Economic Society of Singapore for inviting me back to this very important event where we share our knowledge and experience with our next generation of economists. I always pride myself as being one of the more microeconomics oriented speakers within this panel. I think while macroeconomic factors are important, sometimes microeconomic phenomena, including some single products, can also be world-changing. Think about iPhone or mRNA vaccines. These are the microeconomic happenings that are world-changing. So today, my topic focuses on the economic concept of network effect. And as I'm preparing the talk, I read through the syllabus, the H1 and H2 syllabus, and I think network effect is not part of the syllabus. But as you come into workforce in the future, you will notice that a lot of the important issues around the world would not be something you learned from the textbook in the past, but what you learned, the textbook knowledge, would help build a foundation for you or the methodology, the way of thinking, for you to think about new phenomena that are increasingly important in the world. And network effect is one of them. It is not new. You can see from the picture in my cover slide. This is called the Metcalfe's law. Explaining the network effect using telecommunications network as an illustration. I think most of you would be too young to know that telephones once looked like this in the picture. You probably have seen them from movies maybe, but these are telephones. And the idea of network effect is as the number of users grow within a network, the number of calls possible, if you have done combinations and permutations from your math, you would know that n permutate 2 or n choose 2, then you will get a function that is proportional to the square of the number of users on the network, which means the value of the network grows exponentially with the number of users on the network. And that's the central concept of network effect, which would be the focus of my talk today. Okay, now let's focus on the economic implications of network effect. Network effect is where the value of goods or services derived from a user increases with the number of users using the same good or service. Here in the picture, I use gaming as an example of network effect. Not sure if many of you play games online. Probably the teachers wouldn't like it that I use this example, but never mind, just as an illustration. So the game, of course, the quality of the game, the graphics, etc., are important, but the more simultaneous users online, you will be able to find more companions and enemies, and the game would become more interesting, and therefore the value of the game increases as the number of users increase. the value to you. And therefore, it's a network effect is the demand side phenomenon. Demand increases as the number of users increase. In your textbook, you would probably have learned the concept of economies of scale, which is a more supply side phenomenon. As the volume increases, your average cost of production decreases, and therefore it shifts your supply curve. Network effect is not the same concept. As the volume increases, demand curve shifts instead of the supply curve. So just to draw an important distinction here. Types of network effect. So just to draw a further distinction between different types of network effect. The first is direct network effect. The example here is Instagram. As the number of users increase, you will see more of your friends, your followed celebrities sharing their goings on, and the networks, the Instagram network will be more valuable to you when there are more users around. In contrast, the right-hand side, I use Shopee as an example, which is an e-commerce platform, to illustrate indirect network effect. In contrast to Instagram, you understand that if there are more shoppers on the network, it would not necessarily make the platform more valuable to you, because the number of shoppers shopping on the platform is irrelevant to you as to the value of the platform. However, the more shoppers online, more sellers will be attracted. Now, seller is a different group of users because the sellers want to sell to more shoppers. And therefore, the value of Shopee platform increases to the sellers when there are more shoppers online. Now, more and more sellers coming onto the platform, more product varieties are available. Now, more shoppers will be attracted. And therefore, this phenomenon of shoppers attracting sellers and sellers attracting shoppers forms a snowball effect, where we call indirect network effect, because the attraction comes across two different group of users between sellers and shoppers. And that's why a platform like Shopee is sometimes known as two-sided platforms, because the platform acts as a middleman between two groups of users. So talking about network, why is it important? First of all, network connectivity has always been key to the Singapore economy. In case you're not already aware, Singapore's exports and imports are respectively much bigger than Singapore's GDP itself. It's like 1.7 to 8 times for export, 1.4 to 1.5 times for import. As you learn from textbook, X minus M cannot be more than 100% because of the GDP equation, but X and M respectively are much larger than Singapore's GDP. So what is the intuition here? Singapore, by and large, is playing the middleman role, importing some raw materials, value add to it, and then sell export to the region or around the world. In the picture, I use the refineries in Singapore as an example. Petrol, for example, only about 10% of Singapore's petrol refined are actually sold domestically. The rest are exported. So you will have crude oil imported from Middle East or around the world, refined in Singapore, and the refinery products are re-exported regionally and globally. Another example I can share is pharmaceuticals. There are some pharmaceuticals manufacturing plants in Singapore. They don't make the whole pill within Singapore. Most of them will make the active ingredient within the pill, and then export the active ingredient to Thailand or somewhere in the region to add starch to the body, and then use capsules to make it into a pill as the end product. So just another example of how Singapore's intermediary model works. Transshipment, the port of Singapore, shipment port of Singapore is one of the largest in the world. 80% of the throughput of the Singapore port is transshipment. Again, only 20% of the throughput are actual products going into Singapore for consumption or produced in Singapore for export. 80% of them are transshipment, meaning that they see value shipping the products to Singapore to aggregate, maybe to fill up the cargoes in aggregation, and before shipping to various destinations around the world. Changi Airport, again, passenger throughput is 2 times air passenger arrival and departure, those that actually crosses the Singapore border. So what are the remaining passengers? They are transit passengers that are taking indirect connecting flights through Singapore to elsewhere in the region. So network connectivity has always been very important to Singapore, and that's why that's the focus of my talk today. I will also describe different types of network in the market and their respective impact due to COVID-19. Physical networks such as airlines are disrupted because of the border restrictions and traveling restrictions due to the pandemic. But virtual networks boomed, such as where we are today. Because of the pandemic, this year we cannot meet physically. We're meeting on Zoom, but the number of participants has broken previous records. So this is a good illustration of how virtual network has boomed due to the pandemic. Hybrid networks have transformed. Hybrid networks means certain networks that take advantage of online digital technology, but also involves a physical element in service delivery. Grab is an example here. You can book your ride online, but the actual commute is the physical delivery. Food delivery is another example. So when the pandemic came, because of the circuit breaker, a lot less people are commuting. So there was a significant decline in number of ride-hailing rides. And the network has kind of transformed to put more focus in food delivery, because during the circuit breaker, people stay at home and order food online for food delivery to your doorsteps. So some of the hybrid networks have transformed because of the pandemic. In the next section, I talked about some of the issues arising from network effect. As in many things in this world, network effect creates certain concerns, certain risks, but also other opportunities. So in the next section, I talked about some of the risks before moving on to the opportunities. First, I talk about competition issues in network industries. So the dilemma is that because network effect is so powerful, the value of a network increases with number of users, it can very easily snowball into a monopoly. As a single network dominates the market, capturing most of the users. However, the values, the benefits also increases with the size of the network. And therefore the dilemma is it better to have one single network so as to maximize the benefits of network effects, or to have fragmented networks where each network is smaller, but you can reap the benefits of competition in terms of more competitive prices and better qualities of services and more innovation? Or should we aim at somewhere in between? What I'm trying to introduce to you today is that there are some solutions that would not be mutually exclusive between the two conflicting options, but allowing networks to capture the benefits of competition as well as network effect. The first idea I'm going to introduce is multi-homing. In the picture, you will see a picture I took yesterday from a Japanese cafe, where the same restaurants on all major food delivery networks in Singapore, Foodpanda, GrabFood, and Deliveroo. And I also assume many of you on your phone, you would also have multiple food delivery apps on your phone. This phenomenon is called multi-homing. Users simultaneously online for more than one competing networks. This way, the benefit is that every restaurant would be on every platform, and every user can also choose between different platforms without worrying about whether you can get a particular restaurant as and when you choose the platform. And therefore, since every restaurant can meet every diner on any platform, you have the network effect maximized, while at the same time you allow multiple platforms to coexist and you capture the benefit of competition. So that's the idea of multi-homing. And CCCS has intervened on a few occasions in the past to facilitate multi-homing. In the Grab-Uber merger, one of the remedies we imposed was to make sure Grab would not restrict drivers from simultaneously also driving for Gojek. In food delivery, we also work together with the food delivery platforms to make sure that they don't impose exclusive restrictions on restaurants to prevent restaurants from engaging multiple food delivery players. And since then, the number of multi-homing restaurants has increased tremendously in Singapore. Now moving on the picture on the right, sometimes multi-homing is possible, but it may not be convenient enough. One example is micropayment. The transactions you pay, let's say buying hawker food or small value transactions. While most of the eateries would accept multiple forms of payment, it won't be convenient enough if each payment mode would require a separate machine, a terminal to operate. And sometimes the cashiers would have 4 or 5 different terminals to play around with. They may not be familiar with the options, and the speed of processing payment transactions may be a lot slower, or they may not even know how to accept certain payment forms. So last year, the government rolled out SG QR code, which is a interoperable, unified set of QR code for merchants, regardless of the various payment options, GrabPay or Alipay, Pay Now, Nets, whatever. You use the same QR code to represent the same merchant. And with that, it's a lot easier to manage, saving a lot of space for merchants, and facilitated processing of payment transactions tremendously in terms of the speed and the efficiency. So interoperability, in a way, is an enhancement to facilitate multi-homing. Another set of issues arising from market power of network industries is this idea of product ecosystems. I'm sure you will be familiar with the idea of there is an Apple ecosystem and an Android ecosystem, where usually users belong to one camp, and because of the suite of services available and you're familiar with, it is sometimes not easy to switch between different ecosystems. So there is a key dilemma between having the convenience of the suite of products working closely together for your convenience versus the difficulty of switching. That plus certain financial incentives such as bundling discounts or bonus rewards that it represents cheaper prices for you, but at the same time induces loyalty, and loyalty is the flip side of barriers to switching. In the pictures I use on the left is the Grab platform, having a suite of services between food, car, market, etc. On the right is a page on Google where when you search for certain products, the first thing that pops up would be Google Shopping. So there's this whole set of issues of whether the search engines are self-preferring their suite of products available at the expense of other competing services. And other sets of issues surrounds consumer protection and data privacy, which is my other function at CCCS. We look at competition and consumer issues. And here I just use an interesting case study with WhatsApp's change in terms and conditions recently. For those of you who use WhatsApp, you might have received a prompt from the app to accept new terms and conditions that would seek your agreement to share your personal data for personalized advertising purposes on various Facebook platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. I know that there is some generation gap between Facebook and Instagram, but for those of you youngsters who are using Instagram, just be aware that actually it is Facebook, the same company that also owns Instagram. So you can judge whether you like the idea of personalized advertising that based on your chat content or things you search about, then the corresponding products will be pushed to you as advertising. Everyone is entitled to your own opinion, whether you like the idea. What is interesting in this case study is the manner in which the agreement, the consent is sought from users. In that, if you decline to accept the new terms and conditions, you will not be able to continue to use WhatsApp's service. And some regulators call it take it or leave it approach. Either you consent with all the terms and conditions I push to you, or you simply cannot use my service. Some competition authorities in the world have started investigations whether such a take it or leave it manner is misuse of market power. Also, there is an issue with the clarity of the disclosure. As you can see from the page that was prompted to you, in order to understand in more detail the kind of personal data you are sharing, you need to click a few times into the detailed terms and conditions, read through the small fonts, and try to understand the legal languages. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure if most of the users will be able to understand what kind of data you are really sharing on which platform. And finally, is it easy to switch away from WhatsApp if you are not happy with the terms and conditions? You might have read the news that when this new terms and conditions was pushed through to users, there were massive downloads of alternative messaging software such as Telegram and Signal, causing WhatsApp to postpone its implementation of the new policy to May, which is next month. Does that mean there is competition to constrain WhatsApp from doing whatever it wants? It remains to be seen, because downloading does not mean users can really switch away from WhatsApp to other messaging softwares, because you can download multiple programs. But so long as most of your friends tend to use WhatsApp to message you, you may also have chat rooms including a lot of friends. Some of them may not have alternative apps. It remains to be seen whether actual switching in terms of the number of messages is practical and realistic. So these are some of the risks I highlighted. As I said, there are risks and opportunities, and there are also ways such as multi-homing that would address the competition concerns while at the same time reaping benefits from network effect. So now I turn to opportunities for Singapore specifically. I talk a bit about physical networks first. Aviation, shipping, and logistics sectors. Post-COVID-19, it is a survival game. I think airlines is the best example that I can illustrate that is easy to understand. As you know, airlines would have some direct flights and connecting indirect flights. Usually when the passenger volume is enough to fill up the plane for a direct flight, then a direct flight will be available, such as before the pandemic from Singapore to London, for example. Sometimes the passenger volume might not be enough for a direct flight. Imagine you are in Brunei and you want to fly to London. Then the airline might not be able to fill up the plane for a direct flight. Then you'll fly to Singapore and combine yourself with other passengers from around the region so that there's a critical volume to fill up the planes, and that can justify the cost of flying a flight to London. So, and therefore, in the pandemic world, there is always this calculation between whether to have a direct flight versus having connecting flights. Post-COVID-19, because of the travel restrictions, volume will decrease. And by and large, on average, less direct flights would be possible. There will be increasing reliance on hub and spoke networking, which is the generalized idea of connecting flights, meaning that not all airlines will survive. You might have read the news that in Korea, Asiana and Korean Airlines are merging. In Malaysia, Malaysian Airlines is having some very serious financial problems. And currently, CCCS is processing an application for alliance between Malaysia and Singapore Airlines. So you probably expect in the future, if Malaysian Airlines have financial difficulties in having more direct flights, and more traffic will be diverted to Singapore for connection. So it's a survival game. Not everybody will, not all companies will survive. And for those who survive, will benefit from more connecting traffic and become the hub under the hub and spoke network. And the surviving companies can potentially grow stronger in the post-COVID world. And that's the implication of network effect for such aviation, shipment, and logistics sectors under the new normal. I should also mention that ground logistics capabilities, which Singapore is strong, Prakash has already spoken about it, is also a key winning factor. And in the picture on the right, I use an example of vaccines. Singapore is well positioned to be the transshipment hub for COVID-19 vaccines around the region, partly because of the flight connections that is available in Singapore. So the vaccines can be flown to Singapore first and then flown around the region. And also partly because of the quality of ground logistics that suppliers trust in Singapore. As you're probably aware that the vaccines need to be well refrigerated at -70 degrees plus. And therefore the care in handling the ground logistics is crucial for the suppliers to select the hub they use to distribute the vaccines. And if you become the hub of regional distribution, then chances are that your local supply of vaccines will also be more stable and more resilient. Manu talked about resilience in his talk, and I think this is one example where having good network industries support will add to the resilience of the economy. And such logistics will also create benefits that flow through to the economy, local economy. E-commerce, Prakash just now mentioned that the world is increasingly digitalized. E-commerce sectors are booming, especially post-COVID-19 when more people shop online. From experience, e-commerce seems to be a regional game. You may think that some of the global players such as Amazon or Alibaba may have the skill and the technical expertise to be successful around the world. But it's not necessarily true. First of all, e-commerce is what I call a hybrid network. There is a digital interface online. There is also a physical element in terms of shipping, delivery, and logistics that require regional and local support. So partly because of the logistics and partly because of the language and culture and the understanding of the region, it is observed empirically that e-commerce seems to be a regional game. For those who are interested, there are a number of articles currently circulating online on the story of how Shopee won over the ASEAN region from previous dominance of Lazada. Lazada was acquired by Alibaba in 2016, but after the acquisition, the company seems to have faced a lot of cultural issues. And Shopee, which is a Singapore-based company, has taken the opportunity to grow and has surpassed Lazada's market share in many ways in a number of ASEAN as well as Asian economies, such as Taiwan. I just give you one example how cultural affinities matter. Shopee was the first e-commerce platform in the region to collaborate with Blackpink, the K-pop group, as their brand ambassador a few years ago. And Shopee spotted the opportunity that one member of Blackpink, Lisa, is Thai, and therefore the level of influence this group has in the ASEAN region, and spotted the opportunity. Later, I think Tokopedia also engaged Blackpink as ambassador. So this is just an illustration how cultural affinity and understanding of the clientele around the region can help you grow in the business. So e-commerce seems to be a regional game. In the past, in terms of consumer products, Singapore used to play a very defensive game because we import most of our consumer products, our needs for consumption. And because products are from overseas, in terms of consumer protection, sometimes we are price takers and quality takers. So that has been the case for many years. Now, what is happening is that these platforms have shifted the value from the product level to the platform level. And that presents a new opportunity for Singapore to take on more offense rather than defense in terms of having the necessary high quality standards in terms of consumer protection, transparency, disclosure, in building consumer trust at the platform level, which Singapore can control in terms of at the platform level, although the product may be from around the region. And if this trust can be built with high standards of consumer and data protection, then again, Singapore is well positioned to take on the middleman role of having this platform for the region to buy and sell products. Okay, I also mentioned a bit about what I call virtual networks, where the service delivery is primarily digital without an obvious physical element. These networks require large critical mass and very little incremental cost for worldwide digital distribution. Personally, I don't see particular advantages for Singapore firms to compete in this space on TikTok, Netflix, Spotify, etc. Because typically you need a large critical mass from your home country, such as the US or China, to generate the initial network effect. And then you can take advantage of that initial success to expand globally. Singapore, because of its small size, is a bit less well positioned for the first step. And therefore, in my view, this is one area where Singapore has no particular advantage to grow. That said, being users, we should always be open to new technology and new business models, so that the population, the markets, maintains its digital savviness and openness to adoption of new technologies, so that we are always future ready. As part of the government, we accommodated ride hailing when Grab and Uber first came to Singapore. Netflix, we accommodated it in terms of sorting out the digital rights, etc. It remains to be seen what is Singapore government stance on cryptocurrency going forward. I think I've seen some questions from the Q&A board. I defer to other speakers to talk more. But here, what I'm trying to say is not all types of network effect is suitable for Singapore to pursue. However, we should remain open, even as users, for some of these new technologies and platforms. Finally, I mentioned something about the future, the next wave of network industries coming from this idea of Internet of Things. Internet of Things means a lot of different types of machines and devices connected to digital networks for some centralized management. Because of advances in telecommunications technology, especially 5G mobile connectivity, the connection speed would improve tremendously in the next few years. And that would open up a lot of industrial applications and a lot more variety of industrial devices that could not happen before. And that would bring tremendous benefits to Singapore. I just give a few examples. Autonomous vehicles, driverless cars, can help tremendously in relieving the space constraints of Singapore roads. In terms of passengers, there may be less need to own cars in the future when there is a network of autonomous vehicles driving passengers around. There may be less demand for car parks in central areas because the autonomous vehicles can just drop off passengers, and while people are in office, the vehicles can be driven to somewhere away from the central areas for parking purposes. Some of the industrial vehicles can perform their jobs during nighttime. So a lot of the industrial activities, logistics, driving goods around can be shifted to night hours, and that would ease up peak hour traffic tremendously as well. And all these would require network connectivity and network management in terms of managing the driving routes of the autonomous vehicles. Smart manufacturing. I think Manu talked about factories moving in and out of China and the ASEAN region. So in terms of Singapore, we are space constrained, and therefore in terms of cost, we are at a higher cost base overall. However, we have a highly educated workforce, and therefore we have some advantage in terms of high-end manufacturing, precision manufacturing that requires relatively skilled workers to maneuver the operations. Of course, we are continuously facing challenges from other regions who are picking up in terms of their quality and their workforce. To stay ahead of the curve, Internet of Things would present opportunity for a quantum leap in terms of efficiency of managing manufacturing processes. Remote healthcare. In this picture, there's an example of a medical operation operated virtually from a remote location between the doctor and the patient. If Singapore can develop in this area, you can imagine in the future, it can work both ways. Some patients around the region that are not well connected in terms of mobile connectivity may come to Singapore to be operated by a doctor from the US, for example. Or alternatively, Singapore doctors can also serve patients elsewhere, and that would tremendously increase the size of the target market of the medical sector from Singapore. Smart buildings can help manage energy consumption intelligently and improve overall energy efficiency in our manufacturing processes. So just to recap what I talked about in this talk, network effect is an increasingly important concept for understanding firms and markets in the modern economy, in the digital economy, and especially post-COVID-19. There are both risks and opportunities arising from network effect in network industries, and Singapore can ride on suitable types of network effects to grow and defy its small size and resource constraints to sustain high growth in the future post-COVID-19. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions together with the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fong, for your interesting, insightful time to our panelists. So let the Q&A begin. Mr. Bhaskaran, Dr. Prakash, and Mr. Fong, please.
Thank you, Basil. I think we already have quite a number of questions. So to the audience, thank you very much for your engagement, and please keep the questions coming through. Basil, I'm watching the Q&A and the chat at the same time, I'm not able to see the raise hand, so please alert me if there's someone that I should refer to if they raise hands, because I can't see it. Yeah?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So there are a few questions here, and maybe since Herbert has just finished speaking, there are a couple of very interesting questions for Herbert, and I think we can take two together because they're quite similar, and basically it revolves around the question of balancing the positives from networking effects, but also the need to prevent monopolies. How do you get that balance right? You have companies that are able to get scale effects, network effects like Grab and so on? And how do you balance the benefits from such companies against the potential monopoly effects? Herbert, you want to take that, please?
Thank you, Manu, and thank you for the questions. As I explained during the talk, it is a dilemma. First of all, let's not be too negative about this. If there is no benefits, there is no dilemma. If everything is negative, there is no dilemma. So we have to recognize that for these big platforms, Amazon, Grab, etc., to be able to offer a suite of complementary services is very beneficial to users. But it is also a valid concern that over time they may become monopolies and restricting choices, increasing prices, or making it difficult for users to choose or to switch away. In the talk, I also offered some options that would not destroy the network by breaking them into fragments, while at the same time maintaining openness and contestability of the market, namely multi-homing and interoperability, so that we would allow platforms to expand, to grow their services, to expand their suite of services portfolio available, while at the same time also allowing others to compete. And I should also mention that going forward, you probably won't see exact copycats of multi-service platforms. Google versus Facebook, for example. One may have initiated as a search engine and then expanded into other services. Facebook from social media and then also expand into other services. And they compete and overlap in certain services. So going forward, you will see this dynamic bubbles where different players may have different backgrounds and different strengths from different services. They overlap in certain services, but not all. And they also cross-leverage their strengths and complementarity of services to compete against each other. And such dynamically competitive environment should be encouraged. And therefore, it's a long answer, but in summary, I advocate permissive policy for these digital platforms to introduce and to embark into a suite of services, while at the same time have certain remedial measures to make sure that the respective services and markets are open for competition for players from different suites of services.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Herbert. Just expanding on that, and maybe I can bring Prakash in as well as Herbert. It strikes me that the winners so far, in terms of companies, are either Chinese or American. The winners in this big game where network effects, scale economy effects really matter. So you have Amazon, you've got all the Google and all that. And in China, you have Baidu and Alibaba and all that. But you don't have European or other Asian or African or Latin American winners, right? So is this going to be a world where the network effects in combination with scale economies really benefits companies with access to very large markets where they can scale up, dominate a sector, and then go out to the world and with their lower cost and greater efficiency, smother the rest of the competition? Is that the kind of world that we are in?
So again, during the talk, I drew a distinction between virtual networks Facebook, Netflix, etc., versus hybrid networks where there is a physical component. I would half agree with you that in terms of the virtual networks, by and large, it is the Chinese and US companies dominating the world. The evidence is not so obvious for hybrid networks. I mentioned the example of how Shopee won over Lazada, which is Alibaba, and is also dominating against Amazon, at least in the region.
Right.
And I mentioned logistics, which is physical, as well as the language and cultural understanding of the region being very important. And I think there is empirical support from the market. Shopee is one example. Uber also could not sustain itself in the region with competition from Grab and Gojek. Grab is a Malaysian company. Gojek is an Indonesian company. So I see a distinction where there is a physical component involved in such digital networks.
Thanks, Herbert. Prakash, any comments on that?
No, I think I completely agree with what Herbert said. In fact, one of the investment opportunities we see in the ASEAN region is really in that provision of that last mile delivery, which in places like Indonesia with a very kind of scattered geography is very essential. So that ability to create a local solution, I think to solve these problems, I think still gives some advantage to local companies. And you have to remember, a lot of these markets are two-sided markets, right? So you also have to create an environment where you can bring both the provider of the service in as well as the customers. And I think the local companies can have that advantage in being able to bring the local providers of services into much better than the global companies.
Thank you, Prakash. That was an original question at the outset, covering an area that we have not really touched on enough. So maybe let me pose that to Prakash. Will COVID-19 result in increased polarization and rivalry between the US and China, or instead create more opportunities for those two superpowers to collaborate to achieve common goals? I mean, this US-China thing is a big thing. Maybe we need to just have a few comments on that, please, Prakash.
Yeah, no, sure. I mean, look, in fact, actually, good to hear your views as well, Manu. I know you've thought a lot about this. Unfortunately, the rivalry between US and China was already souring even before COVID. I think you mentioned in your talk about the growing trade wars, but it's evolved much more beyond that. I think the way forward, even in an optimistic scenario, is that different issues can get compartmentalized in different areas. So you can put things in one bucket, which is an area of cooperation. And I think this will involve things around climate change, as well as nuclear disarmament. And I think here, China's pledged to go net zero by 2050. I think is a great step. And so hopefully that areas of cooperation will continue. And then you have areas of competition, which, as you all know, has gravitated very much into the high-tech space, artificial intelligence, etc., things that border on national security issues as well. And then you have the more adversarial areas, and these are the red lines on both sides. So for the US, it's always issues around democracy, human rights, labor issues. And then for China, it's about how you respond to Taiwan, how you respond to Hong Kong. So I think the danger is that this last category of areas where you can get more adversarial relationship ends up contaminating the rest of the areas. And I think that it'll be net negative for the world, because issues like climate change really need to be addressed at a global level. The second risk, I think, is that middle area of competition actually spreads over to this part of the world as well, where it's not just on specific companies, but actually both economies start putting restrictions on different parts of the supply chain. And I think that obviously will impact this region as well. So I think the ship has sailed, and I think we are in a much more challenging environment for these two major economies. But hopefully, I think if we move forward on that areas of cooperation, at least some good can still come out of it.
Thank you. Yeah, Prakash, I agree. Actually, I think things were already bad before COVID, and what COVID has done is really to make the mood even more sour. So you look at these really ugly disputes over whether the virus really came out of Wuhan, or China's claim that it came out, somewhere else and spread in Europe first, and that has become a big issue of contention. So the whole mood has just turned very sour. But more fundamentally, what is going on between the US and China represents a very fundamental zero-sum game, almost, clash of interests, where in its most basic form, China wants the US out of what it calls the Western Pacific, i.e. East Asia, and the US is basically saying, we are going to stay in the Western Pacific, whether you like it or not. And that is just absolutely fundamental, and it is very difficult to resolve. And in the current mood of growing distrust and hardening attitudes in both the US and China, and with this whole mood of nationalism aroused in China and increasingly in the United States, it becomes more and more difficult to find a resolution. And in addition to that, you have the worsening discord over the status of Taiwan. And just over the last few hours, the United States, under the new Biden administration, has liberalized the way US diplomats and other officials are allowed to deal with Taiwan. And that is certainly something that is going to anger the China and give another twist in this downward spiral in relations. So I am afraid that things are probably going to get worse between the US and China, and then find a new equilibrium finally, where both parties try to work out some kind of modus vivendi where the relationship will not be great, but at least it does not deteriorate. So I think that's probably where we are. We're getting a few more questions, and there's one question that's a bit related to what we've just been talking about, and that is a question about the US dollar's future. Do you think there will be a day when where the US dollar is no longer the world currency? What are the impacts on the global economy? How can we adapt? And I guess that's really related to an implicit question about the rise of alternative currencies to the US dollar. And many people, of course, speculate about the role of the Chinese renminbi as well as the euro. Maybe Prakash, you may want to just take up on that.
Sure. This is it's a very big question, and let me separate out the role of the dollar from the rise of crypto. In fact, it's very related to what Herbert was talking about earlier, because there are very strong network effects that currently exist from using an international currency. And you see that in most predominantly in foreign exchange markets. So the more you transact in a particular currency, the more liquidity improves. And so the cheaper it is to transact in the currency. And so therefore it itself reinforces the trade. So for example, actually in most foreign exchange markets right now, if you wanted to convert, let's say, Sing dollars to the Brazilian real, that bilateral market between Sing dollar and Brazilian real is actually very illiquid. And so what happens is you actually convert Sing dollar to US dollar and then US dollar back to Brazilian real. So that kind of concentration on a dominant currency, the network effects are very strong. But I would say at the margin, you have seen some decline in the share of US dollars, but it is still by and large the most dominant international currency. Now, because of these network effects, I think it's very difficult to truly dislodge the US dollar. And ASEAN and actually much of the emerging market world remains hostage to that. So, we spend a lot of time talking about the US Federal Reserve. I talked about how their way of thinking about inflation, etc., is changing. And the reason we do that is because what happens in the US with regards to monetary policy, etc., affects the rest of the world. And it's because of that dominant status of the US dollar. Now, how can it change? Now, I think it can change through a couple of ways. One is if the US is really irresponsible in two dimensions. One is in the conduct of monetary policy. So if US inflation really goes up very materially, such that the real purchasing power of the dollar falls, or as has been the case in the past, if the US starts weaponizing the use of the dollar, and what that means is that they start introducing sanctions on whether people can transact in the dollar, with the aims of trying to achieve some other national security or political means. I think if they push much further on those two dimensions, then I think people will start shifting away from the dollar. The challenge now is that the alternatives are not that feasible. So the euro is a very clear alternative, but there are still fragilities within the euro area structure where they're still trying to get together a very cohesive, unified fiscal status. China is actually increasing its share of the margin, but it's still very low. It's only in the single digits. But you also have relatively tight capital controls, which make it very hard for financial investors to kind of hedge exposures in that currency. So right now, I think the dominance of the US dollar is stable. But maybe very briefly on the crypto side, because I realized a lot of questions there as well. And once again, this is where I think for all the students listening right now, this is a great time to be an economist, because look, the future of money is digital. And I think that is something which 10 years from now we will only truly appreciate. But even if you look at the way you conduct your own day-to-day activities now, many of us don't even carry a lot of cash in our wallets anymore. But in that space, there are a spectrum of different digital currencies. You have central banks who are issuing their own digital currencies, and I think this is a trend that we're likely to pick up. You have these things called stable coins, which are cryptocurrencies, but they are pegged to existing currencies. So Facebook's Libra is one example. Now they've changed their name to DM. And then you have the Bitcoins of the world. I think that going forward, these will come under increasing regulatory scrutiny in that descending order. I think central bank digital currencies will become more prevalent. Stable coins, I think, will gain more traction. But I think the possibility for increased share in crypto, I think, will get challenging. And this is because for a couple of reasons. One is obviously since the September 11, 2001, but as well as since the GFC, the regulations around financing of terrorist activities, as well as around money laundering, have increased substantially. And so that ability to kind of know your customer and tighten the flow of funds to these activities are much harder in the crypto space, and so therefore I think the regulatory pressure will be more. Second important one, which I think a lot of people alluded to, is basically the control of monetary policy. we keep talking about interest rates, but what is the interest rate? An interest rate is only relevant to a specific currency. So if the US, for example, raises the interest rate on the US dollar, but if everyone else is using a different currency, then that transmission of monetary policy to the real economy, which is what all central banks are trying to do, will really be diluted. And so I think those two aspects still will result in a need for control by authorities. But I think that you will still get this kind of side activities that are being done primarily by stable coins. And at the same time, I think that this growth of central bank digital currencies, I think will be here to stay.
Thank you, Prakash. There's some questions about, which are all revolving around the question of government policy, but let me take one and broaden it out so I can bring both of you into the discussion. The question, original question is, what are the views on having the same minimum corporate tax around the world to prevent companies from shopping around for the country that offers the smallest tax bill? Are you in support of such a proposal? But I'd like to broaden this out because I think the root of all these concerns is really rising inequality. And that leads to the sense of unfairness that, some companies like Amazon don't pay taxes. There's a question of inequality being tackled, some companies being treated better than others. But at the same time, there's also pressure because of this growing concern about inequality, growing pressure for more government intervention in the form, say, of minimum wages. And also, I suspect more and more pressure on governments to use more aggressively competition and fair trading, consumer fair trading policies to promote the interests of the small guy against the big and powerful. I mean, we saw that in Singapore, for instance. We saw an instance of the latter in the recent headlines in the newspapers about insurance, medical insurance, and the battle between the Life Insurance Association of Singapore and the Singapore Medical Association. So can I bring both of you in, give your own perspectives on different dimensions of this whole issue of how are we supposed to tackle the rising concerns about inequality, which results in demands for increased taxation, minimum corporate tax rates, minimum wage, fair trading, competition law. Maybe Prakash first and then Herbert.
Sure. I think this is one of the key paradigm shifts that I highlighted earlier that I think is likely to dominate the debate over the next decade or so. I would say that the push for higher taxation comes from two areas. I think one is the inequality dimension that you mentioned, which I'll come to a bit later. But I think the second is actually that post-COVID, governments are actually saddled with very high levels of debt, and you can dilute or improve your debt to GDP ratio through a few ways. The best way that you can do is actually boost growth, and so that basically raises the denominator, and so your overall debt to GDP goes down. And so, I would really hope that a lot of countries use the opportunity to do a lot of supply side reforms. I think that the types that you mentioned that were going on in Indonesia, I think are crucial in this regard. India as well is doing good things. So that is a good way of trying to reduce it. The second way, which I think gets to this point, is actually higher taxation. And I think here you actually have experienced a period where corporate profits have been very sizable. Now it's not even. You have very strong winners and less so, but on average, you have these big tech companies with really outsized profits, but yet being able to evade taxes. So I think there is an element of trying to bolster government finances that is behind this this drive. Now, when it comes to inequality, once again, I think there are good policies, and then there are kind of less desirable. I think the good policies, which many countries should really strive to do, is really try and as I mentioned earlier, just kind of find ways to lift the sea such that all boats rise at the same time. There was a very good article maybe about 20 years ago by an economist at Harvard University, where he says that you can think about people's happiness in a way when they compare their well-being on two dimensions. One is a time series dimension, and the other is a cross-section. And what he found is that these things are actually substitutes. So when people are happy on the time series dimension, which is that they are better off today than they were yesterday, actually they don't care so much about the cross-section. But I think what's happening is that when you're not seeing progress, when you are still as worse off as you are today as you were yesterday, then that cross-section matters, or how you do compared to your neighbor and all that. So I think the shift in policies right now is really to try and say, how can we maintain this accommodative policy conditions? How can we try and have more targeted spending such that we get not only the inequality challenge sorted, but actually the overall economy also goes up, which I think would be the best kind of win-win solution. Because as you all learn in your intro econ books, taxes are distortionary. You will be operating at a less optimal level. But I think that policies that can really help boost the supply side, boost economy, I think are interesting. But let me pass it to Herbert, because I think the part which is, I think, the truly innovative and challenging part here is going back to the issue of corporate profitability. Is how do you think about the monopolies that have arisen here? How do you think about taxing them when their source of revenues are global, and sometimes their source of monopoly power is not kind of predatory, but just kind of natural economies of scale. So I think that is a very interesting question, which I'm sure Herbert has a lot of insights on.
Yeah, Herbert, I mean, I'm also interested to hear your views on, there's this sense during the crisis that big companies bully small companies. Some big companies actually stretched out their payment terms to small companies during the crisis to hoard their cash, which really squeezed the small companies because they were not getting the cash for the services that already rendered, and that really put them in a bad suit. Is this covered by current competition fair trading rules in Singapore, or is there a lacuna in our regulation that doesn't allow us to tackle such issues? Herbert?
I think this discussion is very broad, and if I have to address every aspect, I probably need an hour or so. But I'll try my best to be brief. We are Competition and Consumer Commission, so there are two prongs in our work. I wouldn't say it is our primary function to deal with inequality, because we are primarily for market efficiency. However, I would also say that there are angles of competition and consumer policy which can help addressing such issues. Competition, for example, we would say competition does not redistribute income or wealth directly, but it redistributes opportunities in the market, so that there is social mobility with market opportunities. So that's a fundamental idea. I'm no expert to taxation, but but based on my limited knowledge in basic economics, in taxation, there is always the concern about distortion and disincentive effects in the market, and competition can complement taxation policies such that you make use of the competitive process to allocate your amount of tax and subsidies, so the resources can be allocated efficiently. So that's one angle where competition can complement taxation policies. I would also say that the digital economy network effect that I talked about has created a new range of job opportunities available. Think about the food delivery man, parcel delivery man, Grab drivers, etc. To standardize, we call them gig economy workers that are not traditional employees. They might be freelance, but at the same time, gig economies, unlike freelance workers, do not typically set their prices. Usually they deal with very big platforms, and this is the platform that set prices for them. But on the other hand, their employment contracts, I shouldn't say employment contracts, they are not employees, but their work arrangements with these platforms are a lot more flexible. And the flip side is that in terms of employment protection is a bit less compared to traditional employees. So CCCS has been collaborating with MOM to deal with the interface between competition and the labor market. And there's a special focus on this gig economy workers class, how to optimize between protecting them against big platforms, while at the same time ensuring flexibility and job mobility. And I mentioned earlier, CCCS has worked to make sure that these gig economy workers can multi-home. Grab drivers can also drive for other platforms, etc. So this is one example. In traditional employment arrangements, you probably cannot moonlight. When you work for a company, you cannot simultaneously work for a competing company. That is quite accepted. But this is something that we explicitly encourage in gig economy. So that's one example where dynamics of employment shifts and competition has a role to play. I should also address consumer protection. For those students who have studied market failure being the rationale for government intervention, information asymmetry is the key market failure underpinning consumer protection policies, because consumers typically would not have accurate and adequate information on products, unlike the knowledge by the suppliers. So in a way, reducing information asymmetry would protect vulnerable consumers or less educated consumers, and that would help not only in efficiency, but in terms of reducing the inequality. So there is also this angle. Manu, you mentioned the recent struggle between doctors and insurers. It's a tremendously complicated case study in economics. I'm not sure if students in this forum have learned all the stuff about information asymmetry, moral hazard, adverse selection to be able to fully understand this. But just very briefly, there's this issue of rising medical costs, and there is information asymmetry between doctors and patients. And health is life and death. If doctor recommends you to take certain procedures, you typically would not risk your health to go against your doctor's opinion. When you are sick, you may not have the energy to shop around for competition to take place. And therefore, medical costs tend to increase over time with these market inefficiencies. Insurers have an interest to minimize their claims, because claims would be their business cost, and therefore they share their interest with consumers in terms of trying to control the increase in medical expenses, and therefore they are on the different side of the table from the doctors. Then what is controversial in the recent news is that they have this panel of doctors that restrict the range of doctors available to patients to choose from in order to be able to claim insurance. So this is the way the insurers are flexing their muscles in order to qualify as my panel of doctors. You better don't overcharge or anyhow in prescribing medications and procedures. But at the same time, this also reduces choice for patients in choosing their preferred doctors. And we can understand the frustrations from doctors' point of view that not only are their business affected, but also reducing free patients' choice is in itself controversial. So since I'm not from MOH, so I should not provide any policy answers, and I don't pretend I know enough to be able to give intelligent advices, but it's an illustration that it cuts across competition, consumer protection, and inequality issues.
Thank you. I could go on that, but we only have about 5 to 7 minutes left. Now, there is one other topic which I think is very important for our participants to understand. That is the outlook for inflation and the impact that might have on interest rates, monetary policy, asset markets, and the like. So the question that came is, how has the pandemic affected inflation rates? But I guess the broader question is, what is the outlook for global inflation given these massive injections of monetary and fiscal stimulus, now fiscal stimulus, into the global economy? Will we see a resurgence of inflation? Would that then lead to further rises in interest rates, which then trip over financial markets? Maybe Prakash, you want to take that?
Sure, thanks, Manu. By the way, just to let everyone who's participating to note that I think all three of us have been responding to some of your questions online as well. So if you go to the question and answer, there's a tab that says answered, and it's a good read, I think, of tackling some of the other questions. Getting back to this issue of inflation, I think there are kind of three phases that I think about. So I think in the first phase, which is the near term, actually is a relatively trivial phase, and this has to do with base effects. So as you know, when you measure inflation, you always measure it kind of current price level today relative to price level most often 1 year ago. And 1 year ago, actually, you saw a lot of sectors in the economy related to energy, transportation, etc., where prices fell. And so just from a pure kind of simple base effects implications, you will see kind of inflation rising for a short period. But I think then you will enter a second phase. And I think that second phase is one where, going back to that lockdown index that I showed, you still have large parts of the world economy where mobility is restricted. I mean, I'm sure all of you listening in here as well probably miss going to Johor Bahru for your favorite food or shopping. And so, when that restrictions and those lockdown measures are released, I think that will create another bout of inflation. Mostly because supply takes a while before demand picks up. And so that second phase, I think, happens more towards the second half of this year as vaccination rates pick up and economies open up. I think the big uncertainty is what happens after that. So a lot of these things, base effects and the implications of opening up are all kind of temporary and one-off effects. As you can tell from my presentation, my bias is towards the direction that we will be experiencing higher inflation going forward than we have in the past. I think part of it is the fact that, as I mentioned, these what I call paradigm shifts in macro policies are happening. Central banks are willing to be behind the curve. They want to run the economies hot. And so that old notion of pulling back stimulus, I think is likely to be much later on than in the past. So that's one. Second, I think is, and this actually came up a lot in the questions, is that I think this push to green the economy is actually involves a lot of public infrastructure spending. Some estimates put it as about $1 trillion a year globally, which is about 1% of global GDP. And this is everything from changing the way that energy is produced, changing the way that buildings are run, etc. So there is a lot of infrastructure spend that is coming on. Over time, this will improve the supply side of the economy, but in the near term, I think inflation will be higher. So I think in that third phase, I think is where the big uncertainty lies, and my bias is towards high inflation. But at the same time, I think those of us who are students of economic history, you look back at the 1970s and you look at rates of inflation of double-digit, etc. I don't think we are going back to those kind of levels. And the main reason for that is outside of this fight between demand and supply for inflation, one of the big drivers of inflation is really inflation expectations. And because of a lot of central banks having targeted inflation, etc., inflation expectations are much more stable nowadays. And so even if we see high inflation, it will likely be only a marginal shift relative to where we were pre-COVID.
Prakash, I know we're running out of time, but I just have to ask you this question. I mean, a lot of the discussion and debate is over inflation or no inflation. But my sense is that, excess monetary liquidity in the system need not necessarily just go into excessive purchases of domestic goods and services, which is what leads to inflation. It could also go into imports. And if there's a surge of imports, then you get an increase in current account deficits, say, in the United States, which then leads to other problems, such as currency changes and protectionism, or that excess money can go even more into financial assets and create even more volatility and excesses in financial markets. So is the last question really, is the debate excessively focused on inflation? Should we be more broadly focused on the other potential imbalances?
No, that's a very good question. I mean, inflation has traditionally been the focus for most central banks because at the end of the day, money is only useful if you're trying to purchase some real good. At the end of the day, you want to eat things, and you can't really eat money. And so that maintenance of the value of a currency to purchase a bundle of physical goods and services, I think is still primarily what central banks are focused on. But I think what you've mentioned is increasingly entering into the discussions at the central bank level for two reasons. The first reason actually goes back to the inequality point, because one of the asset prices that has been increasing quite rapidly is actually house prices. And the ability of a young person to kind of get on that housing ladder, to own a house, etc., in most economies is getting very challenging. So New Zealand, if some of you have read the press, have actually tried to address this and have explicitly made house prices part of the mandate for the central bank to address as well. So this issue of financial asset prices actually also affecting consumer well-being, I think, is becoming important. The second reason, I think, is financial stability issues. There was a question on the chat about non-fungible tokens, which I think is actually a good development and can actually better get property rights secured. But there's speculation, and you saw actually a Singaporean resident spend $69 million to buy a piece of digital art, which was authenticated by NFTs. And I mean, it's a symptom of there just being a lot of cheap money lying around. And I think that is increasingly becoming of concern to central banks, because the financial instability that entails will actually hinder their own targets of trying to achieve both inflation and macro stability more generally. So for both these reasons, I think growingly these spillovers into financial assets or even currencies, I think, are becoming much more important.
Right. Thank you, Prakash. I'm afraid we've run out of time. So let me hand over to Basil. But first of all, let me thank both Herbert and Prakash for covering such a wide ground with so much insight.